Welcome to Historically Speaking, episode number 179, Symbols for the New Republic. In this show, we will be evaluating some visual images that really come out of my teaching American Studies for more than 30 years. One of the things I loved about the course and the program was the ability for students to recognize a visual vocabulary connected to historical events. And in this episode, we're going to look at the creation of symbols for a new nation. And we will begin with how in 1782, as a new nation, fresh from the Revolutionary War, we had to create a Great Seal. And somewhat reminiscent of royal courts of Europe with the Romanov eagle, the Hohenzollern eagle, we have the American bald eagle chosen as the official bird of the United States. This overrode Benjamin Franklin's choice because he wanted the turkey as our national symbol. So we can all chuckle what a turkey would have looked like on the Great Seal of the United States. And we see in the rosette above the eagle's head, there are 13 stars. This is very much a Masonic symbol. And we have the motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one. We have the eagle in profile holding in one of its talons the branch of peace, the laurel, the laurel. And in its right hand, we have a sheaf of arrows, so the ability to make peace and the ability to make war. The reverse of the Great Seal of the United States is even more interesting and I think arcane for many people. So next time you take a dollar bill out of your wallet, you could look at this in a bit more detail. We have here a Masonic pyramid. At the base of the pyramid in Roman numerals is 1776, the beginning of the United States, not from the American Revolution, which started the year before, but from the Declaration of Independence. The all-seeing eye, which is a very mystical symbol, has going around the top the Latin phrase Annuit Ceptis, which loosely translated comes to "He has smiled on our undertaking." And then in Latin, of course, which was a language of educated people, we have Novus Ordo Secularum, a new order of the ages. One of the prevalent new symbols of the Republic, and this would be something that would have a long influence on our visual symbols, was the depiction of the goddess Liberty. And here we have a Roman coin from the 1st century with an image, a highly stylized image of a young woman in profile with the inscription Libertas. We also have inspiration for various female depictions of liberty, and this is a distinction that I'll explain to you. This depiction of liberty is wearing a Phrygian cap. A Phrygian cap is a canonical shaped cap that has a floppy end, usually red, and it was something that was made popular during the time of the French Revolution. We'll see how this is going to be distinguished between another type of cap that is simply a canonical shaped cap, not bent at the top, and this is called a pileus. And the pileus would be the symbol of newly freed slaves. When Benjamin Franklin was working in France behind the scenes to get us help during the American Revolution, he worked with a French sculptor to create this image that he hoped would become part of American coinage. So we have Libertas Americana, Liberty of America. We have in profile an image of Goddess Liberty with her flowing hair. And if you notice on the right-hand side, we have a staff and the conical shaped pileus, the symbol of liberty. And in French, Le 4 juillet 1776, we have the date of the foundation of the American Republic. So as this symbol came back to the United States, we felt that in order for it to be palatable for the American Republic, we had to make it look more American. So what happened is by 1796, we had a slightly less complex image of liberty. So we have this liberty coin from 1796. It says liberty right on the top, and we have the pileus, the symbol of the newly freed slave. There were various design changes, and we actually know that there was a she was called a handsome woman of her time, Anne Willing Bingham. We see at the right from a lost sketch from Gilbert Stewart, and she actually became the model for the Liberty coin that was in vogue from about 1794 through 1808. And here you can see that Liberty, slightly low-cut gown, her hair flowing, and this all-American woman was a popular coin image. And it's a remarkable thing that we actually know on whom that this image of liberty was based. We also have the symbol of liberty here in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was a foundational document of the French Revolution. And here if we were to translate the preamble of this, we would see many things in common with the Declaration of Independence. And certainly the two pieces of literature are related, but we also have to remember that the Declaration of Independence was a document inspired by the Enlightenment, as was this document. And on the upper left-hand corner of this painting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, we see the figure of liberty who is breaking the chains of oppression. And we won't have time in this episode, but when we take time a little bit later to look at the imagery specifically in the Statue of Liberty, one of the things that we don't often get to observe with the Statue of Liberty is that she is stepping on broken chains. And at the heart of this, once again, we see the all-seeing eye, the Masonic symbol that is part of our Great Seal of the United States. And we have an angelic figure on the right, as if to say all of this is divinely inspired. Now we have the Phrygian cap. And here you can see how this is different than the pileus symbol, and this became one of the predominating symbols of the Jacobins during the French Revolution. Many of the contemporary image of the French Revolution show people wearing this, and you also notice slightly off-center around the rim of the Phrygian cap is a rosette of the tricolor, which is the symbol of revolution. And what the French inscription says here that you can't quite see because it's a little bit blurry is that this Phrygian cap of liberty unites the shore of the United States on the left and what was going on in the revolution in France on the right. We move next now to another enduring symbol of the American Republic, the eagle. and how the eagle would move from the Great Seal of the United States to show up in a variety of ways throughout American culture. And this print is after we acquired the Louisiana Purchase. This is the city of New Orleans. Here we have the eagle, the bird of Zeus, and it says, "Under my wings, everything prospers." This is a very, very interesting painting by Samuel Jennings called "Liberty Displaying Arts and Sciences." And we need a minute or two to unpack this. First of all, we have the pileus here, the cap of the freed slaves. And in this personification we see of liberty a young woman clad in white. She would become known, particularly in the 19th century, as Columbia. And when you see these images of rather deferential slaves off to the right-hand side of the image, the message here is being imparted that these freed slaves will need the liberation provided by literacy. So this is something that you have to really look at to decode the symbolism that liberty for the slaves is going to involve their education. An example of how this imagery is also going to be working in the early 19th century, we have the depiction of liberty as a goddess. This is a print from around 1800. We have liberty raising a goblet to the eagle, the bird of Zeus. And as an extra layer of symbolism, we have the stars and the stripes in the upper quadrant of the picture, and atop the flagpole, once again, we have the pileus, the cap of the freed slaves. This is an image from the time of the War of 1812, and here we have an American sailor, the American flag. We have the goddess Liberty, once again carrying the pileus on a staff, and she is about to crown the head of the sailor with a laurel. And if you notice, at the feet of the sailor are the broken chains. And the context, of course, one of the many reasons for the War of 1812 was the impressment by the British of American seamen who would simply seize American sailors from various ships. We did not have freedom of the seas. So we have this image with all the symbols fully in operation with the slogan, "We owe allegiance to no crown." Wonderful segue into the archetypal American hero for the new republic. This is the earliest known portrait of George Washington, painted in 1772 when he was 40 years old. The artist is Washington's lifelong friend, Charles Willson Peale. And in this painting, Washington is depicted in the uniform, a red coat uniform, which was a reminder of his service in the Virginia militia. And if Washington's life had stopped at this point at the age of 40, he would barely be a footnote in history for his service in the French and Indian War, and one of many Virginia planters. And I think it's significant that when we look at the way that Charles Willson Peale would change his depiction of Washington to suit the man who would win us the Revolutionary War and become our first president of the United States, and how this would be transformed in art. I love this pairing of miniatures that Charles Willson Peale did in 1776. Martha Washington kept this with her throughout the time that she was separated from George, and in turn, George kept this image of Martha with him. He kept it at his desk during Valley Forge. And when you look at this image of Washington here, he looks, I would say, kind of sweeter and much gentler and benevolent than he would become in some of the portraits that we are about to see. After our victory at the Battle of Trenton, we have this majestic military portrait of George Washington. So certainly as a man who was 6'2", a very large man for those times, a very powerful man, size 13 shoe. We can see what Peale has done is that he has deliberately made Washington look steelier, more determined. His head is slightly smaller to emphasize the girth of Washington, the power of Washington. His hand on the cannon, you can see the battle flag, the battle flag at the bottom. He has been victorious over the British. Here we begin to see the mythologization of George Washington, building him up into a hero for a country, a newly forming country that had to create its own history as a nation from images like these. Many Americans, of course, at that time would not have seen a painting like Washington at Princeton, so we have Peale here making engravings for the masses. So here we have what this says going around the oval engraving. His Excellency General Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Armies of the United States and President of the Convention of 1787. So one of the things that we see with these contemporary portraits is certainly already in his lifetime, Washington becomes synonymous with the new United States. And of course, we have public figures becoming public art, and we have one of the best known contemporary busts of George Washington by the French sculptor Antoine Houdin. We have a portrait here, which curiously was John Adams' favorite portrait of George Washington by the artist Edward Savage. And you may look at this and say, that doesn't look like the Washington I know. We'll talk about that in a moment. And one painting by Edward Savage that we need some time to truly unpack is this one of the Washington family, because Washington is marketing himself as the head of America's first family. So here we have Washington seated, Martha Washington as well, with a map of the District of Columbia, the capital city that was yet in planning. And we have the two Washington grandchildren that were raised by George and Martha. In the left side of the image, we have George Washington Parke Custis, who was Martha's grandson. He would be known in the family as Washy, was his nickname. And we have his elder sister, Nellie Parke Custis. One of the strange things that still surprises me about the identification of this painting is at the rear of the painting, behind Martha, you can see what often is only identified is an African-American servant. We certainly know who this is. This is Washington's personal valet, his manservant. This is a man whom Washington purchased in 1768 for 61 pounds and 15 shillings. His name was Billy Lee. He was at Washington's side throughout the American Revolution. He served him in the early years of the Republic. And in a book that I am reading by Nathaniel Philbrick right now called Travels with George, it outlines the tour that George Washington took through various states to make sure that the country was behind him in his presidency, and Billy Lee was with him on every step of the journey. It just underscores the complexity with which we have to view some of our founding fathers, like Washington, as slave owners. And let me go back for a moment to George Washington's step-grandson, George. George would inherit many slaves. He had many slaves whom he fathered, but his legitimate daughter, Mary, would marry a young soldier named Robert E. Lee. So here you can see the entwining of families, and it was, of course, George Washington Parke Custis's mansion where Robert E. Lee and his wife lived on the eve of the Civil War, and this would eventually, for a variety of complicated reasons, become Arlington National Cemetery. Another heroic image of Washington with the broken column, which is a symbol of power. This goes back to a standard symbol for depiction of Roman emperors. We have here in 1793 a peace medal made to commemorate a treaty between George Washington and a Native American chief. Again, a complicated aspect of our history. Let us also remember that in 1794, as the chief of the army, Washington rode out into battle to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion ensued from the fact that the farmers of Pennsylvania did not like paying their excise tax. So here is Washington, who at this point would have been 62 years old, riding out into battle. This is the most familiar image of Washington. Whether or not it accurately most looked like him, we don't know. This is Gilbert Stewart's famous Athenaeum Portrait, called the Athenaeum Portrait because for many years it resided in a library in Boston called the Athenaeum. This is the image that would be engraved and we see in reverse on a dollar bill. I can't imagine how many public buildings displayed this particular image of George Washington. It hung in the hallway of my elementary school, and when I was in first and second grade, it scared me a little bit because somehow I thought that this image would come back to life. Stewart would paint George Washington again from life in this portrait, much more finished, and this is called the Vom Portrait. And what makes Stewart such a skilled artist is that he builds up his layers of paint very, very carefully. And when you think back to the image of Washington painted by Charles Willson Peale only 25 years before, you can see how Washington is acquiring stateliness. And in the last of the images most synonymous with Gilbert Stewart's portrayal of Washington, we have this one called the Lansdowne Image, because it was presented as a gift to the Marquis of Lansdowne. And in this one, I do know for a fact that Stewart used the Athenaeum head and he simply created the body. So everything is made up in this except the head of George Washington. And people who know much more about anatomical proportion than I do point out that Washington, as a 6'2" man, would have had a much longer body and thicker legs than this imaginary image would have shown. And this is, of course, widely copied through prints and lithographs. We know this one is long after Washington's death because it has the most famous eulogy of Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And that, by the way, was said by Washington's Virginia contemporary, Light Horse Harry Lee, whose son was Robert E. Lee. Once again, we can see how families intersect. Washington also became the subject of decorative art. So here we have two French clocks, one showing the American eagle and a bust of Washington, and then Washington once again, the eagle and the clock. And of course these were made first in France in the 1780s and then more widely reproduced after that. Washington died in December of 1799, and by the time the news traveled through the various states, including Vermont, it would be the new year of 1800, and people thought that the end of Washington, the end of the 18th century, was just a pivotal time in American history. And you can see this highly embellished image of Washington's death. We know that probably his doctors hastened his death by bleeding him after he had developed a throat infection. But once again, this is very much in keeping with highly stylized mourning images that would continue to be prevalent through much of the 19th century. Another image of mourning Washington here. So we have the funeral urn. And in another symbol that will develop at a later time, we'll see how the obelisk became a symbol of the American Republic as transformed from Egypt. This image here is very much part of the mythological aspect of Washington. This, copied in many forms and ways, is called the Apotheosis of George Washington. We see him literally being transformed into a god. Charles Willson Peale's son, a generation later, would paint Washington in this portrait in 1835, where he looks like a Roman emperor seen through a keyhole, a rather majestic portrait of Washington. And this has to be the most unusual statue of George Washington by the sculptor Horatio Greenough. He is Zeus here. And this was once on display in the House of Representatives, and it was a little bit embarrassing to have a semi-clad Washington. So one finds this statue today in the Smithsonian Museum of Arts and Sciences. By 1851, we have the heroic image of Washington by the German artist Emanuel Leutze of Washington crossing the Delaware, a huge painting on display prominently in New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And just to end with a little bit of whimsy, here is Charles Willson Peale's self-portrait, 1821, the artist in his museum, which incidentally was the second floor of Independence Hall. But you need to know this portrait to understand the tongue-in-cheek of Grant Wood's 1932 image, which is called Parson Weems' Fable. Parson Weems, a congregational clergyman, wrote a highly elaborate biography of Washington, and it is he who made up the story about Washington cutting down the cherry tree with the famous phrase, "Pa, I cannot tell a lie." So here we have the head of the Gilbert Stewart Athenaeum Portrait on the head of the child George Washington. I have enjoyed bringing you the symbols of early America, and we will be back with further episodes on the same subject next time.